from Maybe a Better One Knits, here today to talk to you about my top 5 knitting tools. So to knit, you really only need yarn and knitting needles. Those are the basics. But there are some products out there that can make your knitting run a little bit more smoothly, be more efficient, maybe be a little bit easier. So I wanted to talk to you about the 5 tools that, generally speaking, I am not going to be embarking on any project without. I will include links to all of these things in the description box down below. So let's go ahead and get started. So my number one, absolute love it, well worth the $16 investment. This is a gauge ruler from Acreworks. I absolutely love this. If you have watched the channel before, hopefully you know how very committed I am to swatching, how important I believe it is to good knitting projects that fit you well. And this tool really is going to make checking your gauge on your swatches so much easier. So I'm going to get a little bit close up here. You can see that it has 4-inch measurements, both stitch-wise and row or round-wise. And it's a clear open space so that you can very easily mark off and count the stitches and rows in 4 inches. It also has, if you turn it over, these little grippy things which help hold it in place so it's not moving around while you're trying to count. This is honestly just the easiest way to check your gauge for any swatch that you knit. You just pop it on there. It's not going to go sliding around. You line up the little 0 mark, and of course it has both inches and centimeters. Line it up with the edge of one stitch, and then you just count. They're all right there in this little window, so you're not doing that thing where you, oops, I started counting in the row above, or I started counting in the stitch next to it. It's already blocking off those stitches for you, so you can see exactly what it is that you are supposed to be counting. I absolutely love this thing. As I said, it's from Acreworks. The last time I checked, it cost $16. If you do a lot of knitting, particularly garment knitting, where you're of course doing lots of swatching, because we all know how important swatching is, definitely worth the investment. Love, love, love this thing. So, gauge ruler, number 1. Number 2 is locking stitch markers. I bought this giant bag of what we can call locking stitch markers, but are essentially coilless safety pins. There are I think 3 different colors in here. So silver, gold, no, there's 4. Silver, gold, bronze, and black. Let's see, it is just like a safety pin, but there is no coil. These are endlessly useful. You can use them as a regular stitch marker. You can use them to mark individual stitches because they are locking. If you have a small number of stitches that you need to put on hold, like a thumb for fingerless mitts or mittens or whatever, you can actually just slide the stitches on here. And they do make larger versions of these that are plastic and not as useful as a regular stitch marker, but extra useful as a stitch holder. I want to recommend these though, because I bought this giant bag years ago, and despite the fact that I lose stitch markers constantly, it is still very full. I think this was, does it say 500? There are 500 in here. So I might have paid, I don't know, 10 bucks. And these will probably last me half a lifetime, despite the fact that I'm always losing them. So I love the fact that they are thin enough to be used as regular stitch markers. I don't like to have a really bulky, heavy stitch marker on my needle. That they are sharp enough that I can mark spots on my fabric very easily without, you know, if I just push the point partially through a stitch, that's okay. It's not going to damage the yarn or the stitch because they're very sharp. So I can mark anywhere on my fabric. I can use it, you know, to mark the front of something or the right side of something where it's not clear which is the right and the wrong side. And again, I can use them as a makeshift stitch holder when necessary. So many. I will never lose them all despite losing the stitch markers. Like I said, this comes in the 4 colors, but I've definitely seen them in different sets of colors. So especially for raglan sweaters where you need like 8 stitch markers all over the top of a top-down raglan, it's really nice to have a bunch of them, really cheap, different colors. So useful. I use them all the time. Number 3 maybe will seem a little odd for knitting, but it is actually a double-ended crochet hook, meaning it has a hook at both ends. These are so helpful if you have dropped a stitch or you intentionally drop a stitch so you can unravel and fix something, and then you want to pull the stitch back up. That is much harder to do with just a straight knitting needle as you're trying to pull the yarn forward and backward, but it's much easier to do with a crochet hook. I know some people use crochet hooks to make bobbles, and I love the double-ended ones because I'm not a crocheter. I don't need a whole bunch of crochet hooks, so it's really nice to have just one. Actually, I think this came in a set with a couple, but I usually just keep one on hand that's kind of an average size somewhere that'll work for DK and worsted. Those are the yarn weights I use the most. And then let's see, this one is, right, so this is equivalent to US 7 and this equivalent to the US 8. And it's so handy just to have on hand. And like I said, I don't need a bunch of crochet hooks because I don't crochet. So it's nice to have sort of 2-in-1, really easy to use to fix problems in my knitting. I know even some people will sometimes use them for to fix miscrossed cables. That can be really useful for that. Anything where you are pulling bits of yarn through other bits of yarn that are not actively on your needles. It can be very difficult to use your pointed knitting needles for that because instead of working with straight pieces of yarn, you're working with loops. Using the crochet hook, much easier. So this particular set of crochet hooks, like I said, I think there are a few and I have them scattered about, but this is the one I use most. It's from Knit Picks, and it was very reasonably priced. And again, I will include a link in the description box down below so that you can get your own. But having at least one crochet hook in a size appropriate for the yarn weight that you use most often, it's so handy for fixing knitting mistakes. All right, number 4. When you are working on larger projects, sweaters, and you have to move, half the stitches to scrap yarn, you really do have to use scrap yarn for that. But when you are using smaller numbers of stitches and maybe have to put something on scrap yarn, I really love this style of stitch holder. There are a bunch of different styles out there. This one is from Clover, so you can get this at your Joann's or Michael's or wherever you shop. But what I love about these is that you can just take this part off, and this can work as a little spare double-pointed needle. It can work as a cable needle, and of course it can work as a stitch holder. So if you've seen the stitch holders that look like a giant safety pin, they're great at holding your stitches, but not so great if you want to just work directly from your stitches that are on hold onto the needle. So maybe you're doing a 3-needle bind off or something like that, and you want to just start working directly with those stitches that were on hold rather than having to shift them back to another needle and work from there. Those large stitch holders don't work that well for that. But this, it doesn't matter how I put the stitches on the stitch holder because I can pop either end off and then just start working directly from this little miniature double pointed needle or cable needle. So it's really versatile. I apologize, somebody's mowing the lawn outside. So this particular kind of stitch holder is just really versatile. I believe this came in a set of 2, so there were 2 different sizes in there. There's a thinner one and this one, but I really highly recommend a stitch holder that is going to be more like kind of a spare needle for you. I find that is going to make my projects go much faster because I don't have to waste time putting stitches back on the regular knitting needle. I can work directly from this. And then I also have it on hand, as I said, if I happen to need a cable needle, or I happen to need an extra DPN because I'm going to do Kitchener stitch, whatever the case may be. Already there, ready to be used in any number of ways. And the last thing that I want to recommend that you have is a really good knitting notions pouch. Now, what you put in your knitting notions pouch, that's going to kind of depend on you. So in my knitting notions pouch, for example, I have stitch markers and a tape measure, scissors, yarn needles, and T-pins to tighten my interchangeable needles. But what's more important, maybe not more important, but what's just as important is that I have them in a really nice, sturdy pouch. This particular pouch is a felted wool pouch with a zipper from Bird and Bell. I've had this for several years. I got it in a swap, actually. And the reason I like it is that it is nice and sturdy, and there's nothing's falling out of here. So I've had other kind of notions pouches in the past, but if they're just fabric, they can kind of get mushed in your bag and pushed to the bottom, and you're kind of sorting around trying to find them. They've fallen all the way to the bottom. They've gotten mushed by your project. And another thing I've noticed with some of them maybe just have a snap top, or some of them have a not very sturdy zipper, and things start to fall out of them. So I love that this is nice and sturdy. It stands up on its own, so it has a sturdy bottom. The zipper is nice and tight. Nothing is falling out of this. I am never kind of having to search around in my bag for this. It's not falling to the bottom and getting smushed. It is right there holding its own. It's nice and roomy, so I can fit all of those, watch as they fall down, all this stuff in here, because I do want to have all of this stuff with most of my projects. So that's sort of a topic for another time, but having, a couple of notions pouches, if you are a person who is not a monogamous knitter, can also be helpful. But I particularly recommend this one just because it is nice and sturdy. And it's not, there are a lot of really cute notions pouches out there, but mostly their deal is that they're cute and that they're not as functional. So nice and roomy, sturdy, holds everything very neatly, fits everything that I personally need in my notions pouch. As I said, I got this in a swap, which was so thoughtful. I don't know how much it costs, but I will definitely link to the Bird and Bell shop in the description box down below, so that perhaps if you're interested, you can get your very own. All right, so those are my top 5 knitting tools. As I said, you really only need knitting needles and yarn. But if you're looking to make your knitting projects a little bit more efficient, run a little bit more smoothly, I think these are 5 really handy tools to have in your project bag.